Next thing to do is to set up some keyframes on my field so that we can get this effect animated. So this is really simple to do. First thing I do before I want to do that, I'm going to hit Command D on my keyboard, and I'm just going to change my frame rate. The default for Cinema 4D is 30 frames a second. I use 25 frames a second for most of my projects, so I'm just going to adjust that there. I'm also going to give myself a few more frames on the timeline. Let's say 150 frames. I don't know if that's exactly how many I need. Let's just extend our timeline out to show all those frames. I might have to change it later, but that's fine. I can do that at any time. Okay, so let's set up this keyframes on the linear field now. Now, I want this linear field to travel through this text. I want it to take about a second, 1001, that's it, through there. So what I'm going to do if I'm working at 25 frames a second is I'm going to set an initial keyframe at the start of my timeline at frame 0, and then a second later will be 25 frames. So that will be where my linear field has traveled all the way through the text. So let's do that. Select the linear field, make sure your playhead on your timeline is at frame 0, and let's just drag this field on this red x-axis until the text has disappeared off the screen and out of shot. So we're at the right time, the field's in the right place, we've got the field selected. Let's hit the keyframe button, and that will keyframe the position, rotation, and scale of my linear field. There's a little dot that appears on the timeline just underneath the playhead that shows us, yes, a keyframe has been created. Okay, let's scrub forward on the timeline to frame 25. I'm going to get my linear field, again drag it along this red axis, and I'm going to drag it until all the letters are all the way up into position. That way I know my effector has traveled all the way through my text. So we're at frame 25, the field's in the right place, I've got the field selected, let's create another keyframe. So now we can see on our timeline there's two little dots here when I've got my field selected. These are showing me my start and end keyframe. So let's rewind that, let's hit play and see what we get. So there's our text popping up into place. So that's looking pretty good so far. Now, one of the principles of animation is follow-through animation, which is where a movement happens. Once the movement happens, it doesn't automatically just stop. There is some kind of momentum type effect, and that's what we're going to create in here as well to give this a little bit more life. Now, the way that we do that is with another effector. This effector is called a delay effector, and it can add a sort of a springy motion to any MoGraph objects that are moving. So let's do that. I'm going to go, I've deselected everything here, I'm going to go up to MoGraph menu, and under effectors I'm going to make a delay effector. Now this delay effector, at the moment it's not doing anything. I need to assign it to the letters on my MoText. So let's go back to my MoText, and again looking through these tabs I can find the letters section, and I'm going to drag and drop the delay effector underneath the plane effector. The order of these two is important. What this means is the plane effector is calculated first. Once it's done its movement, then the delay effector is calculated on top of that. So let's hit play and see what happens. What I can see here is my text is slowed right down. So as it comes up into position, there's a little bit of easing on it. So it just slowly comes into place. If we have a look at the delay effector and go to the effector tab, this is in blend mode at the moment. I actually want a springy kind of effect, and that is using the spring mode. So if I turn that into spring, now we can see here we've got a little bit of a jiggle going on now. So that's creating that, that secondary sort of follow-through type action where the letters pop up and then have a little bit of a bounce. Now we can control how bouncy that is by the strength value on the delay effector. So I'm going to turn that right down and let's see what we get. I'll just let that play through again, and we don't really have much effect. If I turn this right back up to almost full, and now we've got a really big sort of floating, soft, bouncy kind of follow-through effect. So you can play around with the strength value to get just the right look that you're after for your animation. Now that this is working, if we want to, we can also look back at our plane effector and decide maybe we want a little bit more movement in this. At the moment my letters are scaling up, and bouncing into place. If I wanted to, maybe I could make the text tumble and spin around a little bit. So I could maybe turn on rotation for this, and in one of these axes, I just find my arrows here. Let's see these spin. Okay, there's way too much spin there. They're spinning like a top on top of themselves there. I don't want that. Let's see about this axis here. What do we get with that? So that's having them tip backwards and forwards as they come up. I think what I'm after is, let's put 360 degrees of spin on this axis here. Now the axes in Cinema 4D, the rotation axes are often labelled H, P and B. That's for heading, pitch and bearing. They do correspond to X, Y and Z, but not always in the exact same angle that you would expect them to. So just keep an eye on that. In some places in Cinema 4D, for the general coordinates, for example, you can choose whether you use the heading, pitch and bearing, or if you change your system to X, Y and Z. But just be aware that this change is not always available in all the different aspects of Cinema 4D. So let's go back to that plane effector, and let's go back to the parameters tab. So I've put 360 degrees of rotation in the bearing, and now we've got these sort of rocking, bouncing letters, and I'm pretty happy with that. I might just turn the delay down just a little bit more. Let's turn that down to about 60%, and let's have a look at that. That's looking pretty good. So I've just got a sort of a springy little jiggle on the end of my animation once those letters have popped up. So that's using another effector, the delay effector, to add some overlapping or some secondary motion to our MoGraph that is being moved around by our plane effector.